Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, yes, they did. They absolutely got it right. And here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where Liberty works for you, we keep proving that every time this program comes back on. And I want to take the time today, this being Tom Navolis, yes, that's me, your host, just to kind of promo a little bit on Liberty Works Radio Network in this first segment, because I'm going to be talking about someone else a little bit later, maybe this first segment, yeah, probably. But I want you to be clear that Liberty Works Radio Network is your network. It is a listener-funded network, and I greatly appreciate the grace that I have had these last few years on this network, and the fact and reality that they have always been about your liberty. And understanding that from the very root of first principles. And that's what this program's about. That's what Samuel Adams Returns, because the Anti-Federalists, they were very, very predictive, and they brought the whole concept during that argument of ratification that, you know what, we have to protect our liberties, because at some point in time, the generalized government could and would take and become despotic and tyrannical. And you know what? We see that in so many different ways. And in particular, we see that because, as the Anti-Federalists in particular warned, but I have to say that Madison and even John Adams, who called themselves Federalists, they said that we needed to have a moral and virtuous people. And that's exactly what the Constitution, according to them, could only function and operate within and under is by a moral and virtuous people. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we see it every day at every level of governance, and government, if you will, that we really don't have moral and virtuous people that are elected to office or appointed to various positions. Those that may be, and we're seeing it over and over and over again, those that may be are viciously attacked by those who have become of the new national religion, that being humanism. And that in that if you have founders' principles at all, and including in those founders' principles, which we're going to get to today from Sam Adams, those founders' principles are absolutely and unequivocally biblical Christian principles. So if you exhibit any of those, we can see in the destructive actions inside the Senate, in particular during confirmation hearings, that a person's belief systems are attacked. We see it in the court systems and in the various states that people's belief systems are attacked if they are not complying and caving into, so I'll even go deeper than complying, but caving into those systems and those ideologies which are humanistic, anti-Christian, and therefore anti-constitutional. You know, I bring out, and, sitting behind me up on the bookshelf here is the book, both Not All Conservatives Are Constitutionalists, but the newest book, which I think is really critical, is that From Covenant to the Present Constitution Workbook. I've had numerous conversations with folks this week from all over the country who have been through the seminar. And one of the most telling responses that I've had from somebody was that, Tom, that seminar actually needs to be made a part of the curriculum at the high school and college level. People need to understand that. I went, wow, that's pretty impressive to hear people say that, because I thought stuff was being taught in college. Well, we know it's not. And we know that the majority of the universities are, what do we call them? I guess I'd call them, they're promoters of the Marxist ideologies and neo-Marxists, which I talk about in the book, and I bring, I've talked about in other programs as well. And even at the Christian colleges, except for a few, that there is nothing regarding these truths and principles to which I talk about, and how we are in the condition and situation that we are anywhere else other than the seminar and, the workbook. So, because we spent all April promoting the book, but I thought it was very interesting is that I was having some conversations with folks, and that's what they were saying, is that we really need to go through this. So I'm going to ask you that those in Northeast Ohio, that on June 23rd, to go to the website, SamuelAdamsReturns.com, click on the events section there, and click on the Tale of Two Constitutions seminar for June 23rd. And sign up. If you're in the area, sign up. Be a delight to have you. And you know what? I think you'll really enjoy it and get the depth of what we're talking about. And hopefully, as a lot of good friends of mine and others that I met when I spoke to an Oath Keepers group in Phoenix, I don't bring you to tears when you realize the travesties that have been acted upon us, but that you will smile and take heart to what we need to do in the action items that we will speak about as some solution sets. Which brings me to, in this first segment, is that I had a fabulous interview this week with Chris Arnzen. Chris Arnzen runs a radio program out of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and it is called Iron Sharpens Iron. That's Iron Sharpens Iron, and I believe it's ironsharpensironradio.com. I asked you to go. He's on every night. He does a lot of book reviews, and I was so honored to be on his program because this guy, he gets the laudables, the heavy hitters in all of Christendom, especially in that Reformed environment, and that being especially in the Reformed Baptist environment. I mean, this guy, man, you go to his website and you look at some of the people that have been in there. I just sit back and go, whoa, for me to be able to participate on that program was awesome. And Chris does a fantastic job of interviewing. Not only that, great audience participation. So I highly recommend that you go to Iron Sharpens Iron and listen to Chris. He's on 4 o'clock, Kath, 4 o'clock every day, 4 to 6 for 2 hours every day on that program. And you know what? I'm going to ask something extra special as well. Go there, listen, and support what he's doing. I think it's that of a bang-up job. I had a great time, and I will be on his program again on August 3rd. Is that right? August 3rd is what we're scheduled for? Yeah. August 3rd, 4 to 6 on ironsharpensironradio.com. So, yeah, great stuff. In fact, that interview was all about the newest book, From Covenant to the Present Constitution. And I asked Chris, I said, so what is it? Why did you want someone like me to come on that program when you have all these heavy theological hitters, man? I'm telling you, people, he's got the whiz-bangs out there. And it was interesting because it goes to some of the other conversations that I've had with all of you in this audience, is that many of the churches out there, many of the pastors out there may be heavy hitters in biblical teaching and theology, but they necessarily don't engage in the conversation we do here on Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists got it right. What does it mean to be, and I'm now taking it a step further from the program, you can go on the website, SamuelAdamsReturns.net, or better yet, go to Chris's site to listen to the archive from June 5th. Was Tuesday, June 5th is when I was on, and I'd recommend that you go listen to the program and what we were talking about and the questions that were even coming from pastors on the program, which, were just wonderful questions. So when we look at what does it mean and what is a Christian's responsibility in particular when it comes to governance in the United States, and how does that align with what is in our especially Reformation biblical truths? As you always know, I talk about they preached liberty. What they preached during the American Revolution, what they preached prior to it, what they preached and what they said from that biblical context of what is liberty. And we're going to talk about that in the next two segments. I'm going to take you through, pages, 40, 41, maybe 42 of the book, which is actually a letter response that Samuel Adams makes relative to what some of the Quakers were saying in an argument as to, oh my gosh, we shouldn't be standing up against the king. We should bow down and all of that. And Samuel Adams' retort is really, really amazing from a biblical, historical perspective. And that's really what it comes down to. When we are looking at how do we govern, it's not trying to establish God's kingdom on earth. We can't do that. That would be bass-ackwards, because God's kingdom already exists by virtue of Jesus Christ ascending to the throne and being seated, and by virtue of the fact and reality that he's developing his church. But the church is supposed to be not only looking for the spiritual welfare, but also what are we supposed to be doing around proper economics? What does it mean to have true justice? What does it mean to be good business leaders? What does it mean, in essence, on everything that I talk about? What is the extensibility of the gospel in every aspect of life, including government? And, ladies and gentlemen, today, we don't see that because for the most part, especially in the 19th and 20th century, the churches, which the Anti-Federalists warned, that if the churches didn't do their job of preaching the true biblical Reformation gospel, that we would have the perversion of constitutional governance at the state level, as well as at the national level, which has happened. Just think about this as we come down to this last minute of this first segment. Think about this, is that Massachusetts was the leader in not only who the Puritans were, Pilgrims, the whole settlement, what happened with Connecticut, but also in the development as a first state with their constitution. Sam Adams wrote close to a third of it, maybe, if not more, including with his cousin John. They're perverse now. They're one of the most perverse states and immoral states there is in this country. What happened? What happened at the university level? What happened in education? What happened in the churches? What happened in that a moral and virtuous people are no longer governing? And we're going to continue to talk about that as we look at what Samuel Adams has to say when we come back to, yes, Samuel Adams returning and those anti-federalists absolutely getting it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network, where liberty works for you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network. And I want to remind you that the archives of the programs are at samueladamsreturns.net. And in that menu on the top there of the website, you can also go to samueladamsreturns.com, where you can see the Samuel Adams blogging, as well as you can get the books, as well as you can sign up for the seminars, as well as I hope you are all well. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important that we just continue to look at everything that is happening. All of the attacks that are going on are deep rooted, and there's nothing new under the sun. You know, I want to bring you to, even if we look at where the evangelicals today are having these different arguments, and in so many different ways are saying, some on one hand are going, oh, okay, Trump, we're supporting President Trump, and we're, this and that. He's not a perfect man, agreeably, but you know what? Maybe we understand some constitutionalism. Maybe he's trying to do those things that bring us to some remote realignment within that American DNA, and maybe not everybody understands it. And, we're seeing that he's putting people in place that have greater value propositions that align both with constitutionalism as well as with the Christian values and principles. On the other hand, you have many evangelicals that maybe they have more of a progressive theology. Their theology is still the social gospel theology, not the biblical Reformation theology that our founders had. And we see this, almost an ecumenical battle going on out there. Well, you want to know something? Nothing new. I always talk about this idea that Proverbs 1:9 says that there's nothing new under the sun. And we have to bring it into the context. So, what I always say, that Sam Adams wasn't the beer-drinking, lush rabble-rouser that the media and TV programs and, all the different videos and books and all that other stuff make him out to be. And I'm going to prove it here to you in a minute, because what we had going on is that you had the Pennsylvania Quakers and some of the more non-activist denominations, and they were more biblically sound denominations in many ways, almost Reformation solid, in respect to what you had with Congregationalists at the time. Modern Congregationalists are, I don't know where they are. I guess there may be some that still have retained their Reformation belief, but I'm scratching my head to think, and you know what, if you know of any out there, congregations of Congregationalists that hold to the same Reformation principles that Samuel Adams' congregational churches did, I'd sure like to know about that. And I'd like to commend and congratulate those pastors that are still holding those truths. But to that point, you had this ecumenical kind of thing going on between the Pennsylvania, I call it the Pennsylvania Dutch, the Pennsylvania Quakers, and the rest of, especially the northern colonies in Massachusetts. So one of the things that I bring to, as I talk about covenant and where we are in covenant at the beginning of the book and the lectures and the seminar, is that out of the Life and Public Service of Samuel Adams, Volume 2, William Wells writes about these factors and this equation about divine providence that I look at a covenantal model about, and leadership. And in the book, I take you through what those 5 principles and stages and identifiers are that we can look at in covenant relationship overall. But here we had the Quakers were abhorred about the writings that talking about what was going on in stepping away, trying to, break away from England, and that body in counseling submission and wanted a continuous dependence on Great Britain, and had in their address spoken of changes in government. So I'm going to read to you a little bit here, so excuse as I do that, and as it talks about from what Wells wrote again in the About Samuel Adams. And he goes on to say that they were writing about this and the changes in government that were being proposed as affecting every mind with the most awful considerations of dispensations of divine providence to mankind in general in former ages, and that as the sins and iniquities of the people had in ancient times subjected them to grievances, suffering, the same causes might still produce the like effects. They then quoted certain ancient testimony as their proof of concept. So here we have the Quakers, if you will, and here we have where anybody can try and argue their biblical position and quote scripture. But how then does it really support from those ancient activities and ancient history in its true context? We had that during the Reformation. We even had it with what was going on with the Church of England and the Scottish Reformers. We had it in some differences even between Luther and those of the Lutheran breakout and Calvin. So, and then obviously they had it very strongly against, what was different within the context of the, Catholic Church in relationship to the Reformation. So when you put it all into context, it is where do we really look at what Chris's program is, iron sharpens iron, and how the Bible gives us its straightforwardness, but depending on sometimes people's personal agendas, insecurities, and other issues, they miss the points of a historical perspective and setting of what is biblically true. So, we had the Quakers just continued to argue this, no different than we see this, conundrum that we have between some of the evangelicals in our own time frame. And, here we have that they were talking about that the kings, the setting up and putting down kings and governments is God's peculiar prerogative for causes best known to himself. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. That's true. And that it is not our business to have any hand or contrivance therein, nor to be busybodies above our station, much less to plot and contrive the ruin or overturn of any of them, but to pray for the king and safety of our nation and good of all men, that we may live peaceable and quiet lives in all goodness and honesty under the government which God is pleased to set over us. Well, that to me is a lot of the misreading of Romans 8, I think it is, or Romans 13, it's Romans 13, 12, 13, that whole thing on government and all of that. And, I think that's where, this is where the Quakers were coming. Hey, you know what? God gave us government. We're supposed to just kind of go along, la, 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 la. He goes on, these Quakers go on to write, may we therefore firmly unite in the abhorrence of all such writings and measures as evidence of desire and design to break off the happy connection we have hitherto enjoyed with the kingdom of Great Britain and our just and necessary subordination to the king and those who are lawfully placed in authority under him. Well, before I get to Sam Adams, because we're going to talk about how he took exception to this in particular, is that there's nowhere in there that Jesus spoke of, Paul wrote of, nor was there any examples in the Old Testament at all where we were supposed to totally bow down to tyranny. I mean, we can just go and look at Jeremiah. And who did he talk to? He talked to even those in Israel that were, taking and slamming all of the folks there. We could talk about Daniel and so on. I mean, here he was within the government making changes within it, but never bowed down to the tyranny and the despotism that came through Darius or Nebuchadnezzar or any of that. So anyway, to get through this, because we only have a few more minutes left in this last segment, and I'll tell you, we actually have probably more than I'll get through, so I'm going to run you through some of the big pieces here, that Mr. Adams accepted this religious providential view of the question and replied soon after, showing by historical examples that as the rise and fall of empires and rulers was within the special prerogative of God, the present revolution was nonetheless the result of omnipotent design, and that in God's providence the time for the establishment of an independent commonwealth in the West had arrived. Men were but the instruments in his hand for such purposes. Divine will had evidently selected the present moment for the separation of America from Great Britain. Then this essay, like the Quakers' address, was directed to the people in general. So this essay was published all over. And I'll give you the reference to the essay, because we're definitely going to get to more of it in the next segment, but we're not going to get to all of it. But let's just go with the opening. So here's the opening. When the prophet Samuel was sent to Bethlehem to anoint a king out of the house of Jesse, and had the eldest son of his family brought before him, his lofty stature and goodly appearance made the prophet cry out, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But he received this gentle reproof from his divine conductor. Quote, "Look not on his countenance, nor on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not a man as man seeth, for man looketh on the outward appearance, but God looketh on the heart." End quote. Now you got to remember that as we go forward in all things, because the Anti-Federalists talked about that over and over, in that, somebody can look good as a candidate, as a politician, but boy, oh boy, they can talk about liberty, they can talk about all those things, but you know what? They're dirtbags on the inside, and they're connivers and deceivers and everything else. And, we got some challenges here in Ohio around that as well. So he goes on to say, as we get down, what do we have, about 2 minutes left, Kath? Yeah, we're down to our last 2 minutes, is that were man to set about the destruction or dissolution of a great empire, he would begin by making choice of one of the mightiest powers on earth to effect it. Then vast warlike preparations would succeed, and he would continue on and build these great armies and so on. He talks about it. Invincible armies. All would now begin to move and all of that. But in a few months, he would convince himself that without God, he could do nothing. Well, I guess if you're a godly person, that would be holding to true. But the fact is that, what is that success, and what does it mean, and how does it come about? But, we're going to look at what Sam Adams was talking about from this historical perspective. And as he looks at these Assyrians, one of the things he says, it always gives me sensible delight when I see public calamities affect mankind with a sense of religion and earnest desire of reformation. And I most heartily concur in the sentiment with the representatives of a certain people that our minds ought to be affected with the most awful considerations of the dispensations of divine providence to mankind in general. In former ages, that we know how to conduct ourselves in like circumstances to avoid as much as possible the appearance of resisting divine will as publicly declared in his providential proceedings, lest we should be found to fight against God. That's what we see so often, and that's what we see in the United States right now as we have this last half minute, is that on the Democrat side in particular, they are absolutely fighting against God. They absolutely are. And in the Republican or the Republican side, we're also seeing a lot of that in the establishment component. So we only have a small independent section as well as the Freedom Caucus that, are trying to hold to some real strong fundamental principles. And we're going to pick that up as we come back into the third segment here on Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists, they got it right. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third and last segment for today, which of Samuel Adams Returns, those Anti-Federalists get it right, which, and I talked about which as I came into this, because which we're not going to get through everything. I never have enough time, and I wish I did, but as we get into this, let's just jump back into Sam Adams. He was talking about, and I brought to you the whole idea that, right now, let's face it, I will say that if there are things that are going on in America, some of the greatest areas of judgment that we can look back, and God judges nations. Anyone who is foolish to believe otherwise, my goodness, I feel so sad and sorry for you. It's just very difficult. And I know on this network I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm not preaching because I'm not a preacher, but, at least I'm speaking to those that have some like-mindedness. The point being is that God does judge. And those that don't want to talk about it, even from their pulpits, that God judges the nations, are missing the fact. And so then when we come to how do we define, qualify candidates for good governance, they miss that point as well. So as Sam Adams was arguing, if you will, and taking what the Quakers were talking about as God's providential hand on government, on leadership, on governance in general, he brings to a position that which counters what turns out to be some of their bad theology, if you will. So what we have then is he continues on talking about the Assyrians. So here he goes into this historical perspective of the Assyrians. One of the first and greatest empires recorded in antiquity rose to such a height as nearly to command the then inhabited world. The conquest was that her rulers became corrupted and arbitrary. Listen to that very, very closely because, that's what we got going on. Rulers becoming corrupted and arbitrary, forgetting the divine designs in appointing them. So if we believe that even those that become elected are already predetermined by God's divine providence, a lot of them became corrupted, arbitrary, and forgot God's design right off the bat. They forsook the paths of justice and equity. Okay, social gospels, bad theology, so on and so forth, and looked upon their people as made for their pleasure. Oh, my goodness gracious. Are we talking about the neo-Marxists, Democrats, and establishment Republicans? Oh, wow. Anyway, this brought down the divine vengeance upon her, which was executed by the Medes and Persians, two nations at the time of small consideration. On the ruins of the Assyrians arose the Persian Empire, which grew to equal, if not superior, height and iniquity. It, too, was destroyed by the Macedonians, a people of no political signification, a few years before they were called by divine providence to effect this great work. Let's see. The next great empire we read of is the Roman, which, having arrived at the height of luxury and pride and arbitrariness, fell by the hands of savages who to this day have scarcely any historical existence. The Turks and the Saracens, of all the people at the day, the least in the opinions of mankind, divided the Eastern and Western Empire between them. Thus, most, if not all, of the great empires in the world have successively been overthrown by nations which, in their time, were of no political consequence. Wow, what are we seeing with the, with the rise of China? What happened? China being a nation that was just burdened in communism. And through our own internal corruption, the greater desire for currency and economy, and forgetting about liberty here in America, we gave everything away. And so I have to say that what President Trump is doing to try and rein back China in is of great significance for us in America, because China was nothing. And here it is. It's becoming domineering, of no political consequence on the global scale at one point in time. And look where they are now. Okay. And there are a few, if any, examples of one great empire being overthrown by another. The contest between Rome and Carthage was that of two great cities aiming at universal dominion, neither having at the time arisen to empire. Thus deals the divine providence, always taking steps which appear strange and wonderful, that the whole may bear the evident marks of his hand. We have to give everything to the glory of God. It's just that everything that goes on, it is his overwatch, his great eye, his glorious mannerisms and vision sees it all. So Sam Adams continues, to apply this to our present circumstances and receive instruction thereby, let us take a view of the present state of Great Britain. I say let's take a view of the present state of the United States and the conduct of divine providence towards this country. And it will enable us to discover the designs of providence and what measures we ought to pursue that we might effectually cooperate with the divine intentions. Wow, Sam's starting to sound like, some kind of a prophetic minister here. Anyway, actually, he's probably more Zwingli or, Calvinistic, and definitely John Knoxish, if you will. Because he read all of that. He understood it. So here we go. It must be allowed by everyone who has the least knowledge of the English nation that there is no degree of vice, folly, or corruption now wanting to fill up any measure of iniquity necessary for the downfall of the state. Whoa, time out. As you and I watch the news, I don't watch it regularly. I pick up stuff, off of YouTube, because that's all I have, or what I see on the internet and from other direct stories, or what I see in the local newspaper, and that relative to even county government. Let's go over that again. He's saying here in America now, not England, there is no degree of vice, folly, or corruption now wanting to fill up any measure of iniquity necessary for the downfall of a state. I think we're pretty filled up with all of that, as we consider it. From the king on the throne to the meanest freeman. So from the king on the throne, let's talk about from the governor's office, depending on what state you're in. Let's talk about the heads of political parties, all the way down to the county level. Let's talk about all of those that are in governance somewhere. You can, fit it accordingly to where you are and all of that. From whoever you consider the king on the throne to the meanest freeman in the nation, all is corrupt. Period. The crown, far from regarding its duty in the political world, only uses the public money to bribe the public officers. Democrats. the legislator grants the money of the people with a degree of cheerfulness proportioned to the prospect he has of handling it through fingers of corruption. Oh my goodness, what is that inside of Congress and all the payoffs with the lobbyists? Anyway, hang on, hold on, buckle up, here we go. The freshman sells the importance he possesses in the state it's the freeman. The freeman sells the proportion to the prospect he has of handling it through, back it up again. Sorry. The freeman sells the importance he possesses in the state for the good of himself and his neighbors for a belly full of porter, and gives his vote to the man who, by the largeness he offers, that means the guy looking for the vote, shows he is the most unfit person in the nation to be possessed of the trust. Oh my goodness. Thus men guilty of the worst vices possesses the places of power and trust, which ought to be filled by none but those of the greatest integrity and virtue. And the consequence is that the nation is ruled with a rod of iron, and there is no part of the empire free from oppression. Her princes are corrupt, her nobles degenerate, and the representatives of the people are bought and sold. The government moves on the springs of iniquity, and the measures of their conduct is directed by their power of execution, and not by justice or equity, so that it is perhaps impossible in all of history to produce a more complete state of corruption in government. Is nothing to this for bribery is descended to the lowest dregs of the nation, and nothing is free from the touch of pollution? The omnipotence of the Almighty is arrogant by men who rule with the tyranny of the devil. This is Great Britain. This is Great Britain's true but melancholy condition. I say this is America's true and melancholy condition. The eye of partial affection may cast a veil over it, but ingenuity and candor will acknowledge the facts. Tell me, then, ye devotees of religion, the intentions of God to a nation like this, and point out the advantages of being reconciled to such a government. Ladies and gentlemen, it goes on a lot, and I mean there is twice as much as I already covered, and we have about 2 minutes left, Kath, and so we need to wrap that up. You see, that's why I say that there's nothing new under the sun. That Proverbs is God's divine word forever. And if we do not hold to the principles of His truths, we constantly look at what happened in the Old Testament. You know, I was studying Gideon this past week, and it was really, really interesting that here's the guy that was in the barrel that does the whole fleece thing, and then he takes and he knows that he's called by God. He goes out, and people say, yeah, Gideon, we want your family to go out there and kick tail on the Midianites and, set us free from all of these enslavements, so on and so forth. So Midian does that. And, a lot of you know the story where God finally comes back and says, send all of those home that are afraid, so on and so forth. Let's go, go tromping through the river over there, or the stream, the brook, cross over. And in doing so, those that stop to drink, you guys can go home. Those that cup as they're walking, and drink, perfect. And what happens? With 300, God goes out and routs the Midianites, where they actually kill one another with the sword, and so on. And it continues on in the story. So Israel then says they want to make Gideon king. And Gideon says, no, I will not be your king. For God is your ruler, and He is your king. So he established that truth. But you know what? Gideon messed up, ladies and gentlemen. He sought after economy and all of that, first, instead of continuing in that truth. You say, hey, give me all your gold that you got from these other guys. And what's he do? He builds a false god, and Israel all of a sudden takes off and starts worshiping that and falls into the same insanities and problems that they had because they went from understanding that truth of leadership and taking and looking at, I sum it up with it, economy over liberty. And when we step away from the truths that Sam Adams, you'll get the reference here, and you have it in the notes and everything. But come on back next week when Sam Adams will return, because those anti-federalists, they absolutely got it right here on Liberty Works Radio Network.